Hello, in this podcast we're going to be learning about biodiversity, and we're going to be expanding upon what we learned in earlier units in the ecology units about biodiversity. In this podcast we're going to be defining biodiversity and species, and we'll be learning different definitions of those, and also we're going to be describing the benefits of biodiversity. First, we're going to look at the definitions of species. And there are three definitions. The first one is the reproductive definition. That definition states that all organisms that are potentially able to breed together in nature and produce fertile offspring, those are all members of the same species. So, for example, a horse and a donkey, while they can breed and produce offspring, those are not members of the same species because their offspring are not fertile. This definition is not the best one because there are plenty of species that do not reproduce sexually. And the problem is that in that case, each individual, according to this definition, would be a separate species. So it's not the best one. The best one is the second one, which is the evolutionary species definition. And that states that a single evolutionary lineage of organisms would share genes and maintains its integrity compared with other lineages. So that for this one, there's a lineage. In other words, they all come from the same ancestor, and genes are shared between them. So that one problem that you could potentially have with the reproductive definition is, for example, in dogs, where a Great Dane and a Chihuahua just simply cannot mate, so that brings problems with reproductive definition. It does not bring problems with the evolutionary species definition. They do share genes because each of those breeds can mate with other dogs, and genes can be shared between those breeds. Another important thing about evolutionary species is that subspecies are included within this, and those subspecies eventually can maintain its integrity and then become a whole different species. The third definition is the phylogenetic species, and this one simply states that a group of organisms, they share an ancestor and maintains its integrity compared with other lineages. This one is not as good because it doesn't allow for subspecies. Now we also have three definitions for biodiversity, and they're actually three different complete concepts of biodiversity rather than different definitions of the same thing. There is genetic biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity is looking at the genes themselves, that within an individual species, it's the measure of the variety of different versions of the same gene within an individual species. Like looking at, say, the gene for eye color, how many different versions of eye colors are there? And for that, in us, in humans, there's not a huge variety of different colored eyes. So in that case, there's not a lot of genetic biodiversity, and actually, in fact, in our species, there is not a lot of genetic biodiversity. Where you do find a lot of genetic biodiversity are in dogs. Dogs are genetically the most biodiverse species around today and probably in all existence. Then there's species biodiversity, and species biodiversity is the number of different species within a community or an ecosystem. We'll get more into that in a little bit. And then ecological biodiversity is a measure of how rich and complex the community is. There we're looking at the number of niches in the community, the number of trophic levels in the community. More niches, more trophic levels means there's more biodiversity. And also how complex the food web is. Also looking at the number of processes that recycle the materials. Measuring species diversity, we use the Shannon-Wiener Diversity Index. And we actually used this back at the beginning of the year when we measured the diversity of species in the courtyard. And over here are the formula for that, where H is the Shannon Diversity Index, and basically we're taking the sum of pi times the natural logarithm of pi, where pi is the fraction of the entire population of species I, and s is number of species encountered. And you got to remember to use the natural logarithm and not the base 10 log. So here's a typical problem, and this stuff over here is basically how we go about this. So we start off by finding pi. So we have to total this up, and the total here is 100. So 96 divided by 100 is 0.96, and this over here is 0.01, 0.01, 0.01, 0.01. And then we put in the natural logarithm of this, and for that you have to use a calculator. And the natural logarithm of 0.96 is negative 0.04. And then for 0.01, the natural logarithm is negative 4.6. And since these are all the same, it's negative 4.6. And that makes things a little bit easier for us. And then we multiply these out, and we put the negative in there to get rid of the negative sign. Negative 0.46 times 0.01. So over here it's 0.05. Now the reason why I did this one here first is just simply because I had negative 0.46 on my calculator. Now I'm going to do the other one next. So we have 0.96 times negative 0.04, and that gives us over here 0.04. So we add all of these up, and that gives us a Shannon-Weaver diversity index of 0.24, which is not all that diverse. It's a very, very low number. If we look at species evenness versus abundance, here we have two pictures. If you look at these over here, we see that both populations have the same species richness. Species richness is how many species there are in the community. So they have the same number of species. But if you look at these, that the second population has a much greater evenness than the other, because you see that in the first one there are a lot more elephants than there are of anything else, just like what we had in the problem that we worked in. So we say here that the second population shows greater evenness and also has greater diversity. Let's see what would happen to the H value. Now instead, let's see, we've got here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species here. So let's make them completely even. Instead of having 96 and all ones, let's have 20, 20, 20, 20, and 20. And it's still going to add up to 100. So we have exactly the same number of individuals. It's just that now the evenness is much, much more. So now pi is going to be all along 0.2. So it's just right down to be here 0.2, 0.2. And let's find the natural log of 0.2, which is negative 1.6, which is negative 1.6. And then we're going to multiply those two numbers together, and that gives us a number of 0.32. Oops, just ignore that. Add all of those up, and that gives us a number of 1.6, which is a much higher number than what we had before. So sure enough, that when we have population that is much more even, that according to the Shannon-Wiener Diversity Index, we have a species diversity. Now the next few slides are from a book called 1 Cubic Foot. And what the author here did is he took pictures of the species that appeared in a 1 cubic foot that over the course of 24 hours. So here in this picture, this is taken in a public park near Cape Town in South Africa. And here's a picture that shows the species that appeared there. And these were 30 plant species, 70 insect species. And if he did this just a few feet away, we'd find a similar diversity, but we'd find that the actual species themselves would be very different. If we compare this to the canopy of a rainforest in Costa Rica, we see that species diversity is much more. And here we find that there were more than 150 species of plants and animals, and here's a collection of some of them in this picture here. Compare this to what we were discussing in an earlier unit. If we could look at a cornfield in Iowa, and this is a field which back when it was a prairie had a fairly good biodiversity, but here they apply lots of herbicides, lots of pesticides. And look in this diagram here, you see the biodiversity is profoundly low. And not only does this diagram here show the number of species, it also shows the number of organisms. You only saw one example of each of these organisms, except of course for the corn. Now the biodiversity is, as you can see in those, are not spread out evenly throughout the world. There are biodiversity hotspots, places where biodiversity is really, really high. So 60% of the biodiversity is located on just 1.4% of land's surface, and also contains 75% of the most threatened mammals, birds, and amphibians. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the benefits of biodiversity. We're going to start off looking at wild plant species. And there could be as many as 80,000 edible wild plant species. And we only have a few of them here in the United States. If you go elsewhere, you can see a few more. And here I have a clip from a TV show, and that's taken from one of the biodiversity hotspots.
The tiny island nation became known as Independent Samoa after 1997 and remains the least traveled to of all the Polynesian countries. Almost 3/4 of the people make their home on Upolu, where the capital city of Apia is located. Samoans celebrate food, which is well in abundance. The fertile volcanic soil produces an unimaginable array of tropical fruits, while local waters are teeming with exotic delicacies. And what better way to get to know the Samoans and their culture than by checking out the local markets? One of the largest and busiest ones in all of Samoa is called the Maketi Fu. There is lots to take in, so I've asked one of the locals to help me navigate this busy market. Nisa? Andrew.
Hi! How do you do?
Nice to meet you. I'll tell you, you were right. Look for the most colorful woman at the market. It was you.
Thank you.
Nisa Uesele has been coming to this market since she was a child, and she's taking me straight to the most unusual foods that they offer here. What are these?
Oh, they are salmon apples. They're called V.
Oh, wow.
They can be eaten green or ripe.
If they're only grown in Samoa, I gotta try it.
It's from a big tree.
You have to take the skin off?
Skin off, and then eat the white flesh. It has a big spiky stone inside.
Most of the time, what things look like is not what they taste like. This looks like an avocado married a pear and they had a baby, and that's exactly what it tastes like. Wow. 2 out of 3 Samoans make their living doing some kind of farming, and a lot of that produce is sold right here in this market. The fruit selection is second to none. Papayas, star fruit, and more than 20 varieties of bananas.
These are local bananas.
They're really spendy.
Oh, very expensive.
$3 for all those.
And if you want to eat them raw, you have to ripen them. It's not ripe yet.
Wow. Once they're ripe, they can also be cooked and taste just like any other banana. families have passed down these stalls through generations, selling many of the same types of foods their grandparents offered. One in particular requires a little bit of explanation.
This is it. Saya.
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 What is saya?
Sea slug. The inside of one slug. The saya slug.
Oh my gosh. Yes, the gutted insides from the sea slugs are bottled in salt water. Nisa says the color and clarity of the seawater means these sea slugs' guts were bottled fresh this morning. Now, I'm a texture kind of guy, so this slimy concoction is putting me off a little bit.
It smells like seafood.
The smell is one thing, but it looks, well, it looks a lot like snot. Oh.
Yeah, I think you have enough there.
Well, what happens if I really like it?
Oh, you still have the whole bottle.
That's a very good point. The sea slug used to make saya is also known as a sea cucumber, which is one ugly, slimy critter. Why are you laughing at me? See, this is always the tough part.
She hasn't seen an American eating saya.
All right, here's the problem. First, there's the texture, because those guts in there it's very difficult. Secondly, these little white bits that are in here.
Hard.
Hard? They're like rocks. The saltiness I can handle. The spoiled flavor I can handle. But there's an iodine bile bitterness to one of those pieces in there that is, I mean, that is ferocious. Saya is one of those foods you had to grow up eating to appreciate. One thing I can always appreciate is the type of small restaurant associated with a market. The foods are usually fresh and flavorful. What are these?
Pork pies.
Pork pies? Oh, yeah. I'll do 2 of the fried. The portions are another reminder. Eating in Samoa is a national pastime. That's how I know in a former life I used to be Samoan. Samoans call this kakapua. I'd call it pork on a bun, but there's a surprise inside. Well, it's like a pork jelly donut, but instead of jelly, it's got the pork and gravy in there. That's fabulous. Other familiar food takes on unfamiliar flavors at a place like this. To paraphrase Gershwin, you say lamb, but I say mutton. Most people in America aren't used to mutton, but in the rest of the world, they let the lambs grow to maturity. Food like this is perfect sort of market food, you know? Oh. Wow. That is so good. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you meeting me this morning.
I enjoyed your company.
Thank you. Just one day into my trip, and I can see why people come here for the food and stay because of the Samoan hospitality.
So a lot of our medicines come from plants. Some medicines are just simply synthesized. Like Lipitor, which is one of the most profitable medicines that was ever made, was synthesized in a laboratory. But most medicines do come from plants, or they are derived from plants. Like, for example, Novocaine is a medicine that we definitely benefit from in the dentist's office, and that actually derives from an illegal drug. It's derived from cocaine. And pharmaceutical companies are spending millions of dollars every year looking for new medicines. Another benefit are the ecological services behind this, and this we had discussed earlier in earlier units. If we take a species away from the ecosystem, that could upset the cycling that occurs in there, that could upset the trophic levels, and it's hard to predict what would happen. Another benefit from biodiversity is the aesthetic value of biodiversity. For example, if you look at this picture over here, this was a benefit that I personally had. This came from my getting a grant from Fund for Teachers, which allowed me to go to the American West and visit various national and state parks. And this is Steens Mountain. I was able to use rocks that I picked up when I during teaching, and also pictures like I'm using right now when I'm teaching. And this was probably the most beautiful spot that I've ever had lunch in my life. As beautiful as this picture is, it just does not give the scene justice. And if you look at this table over here, this shows the number of people participating in just viewing the natural scenery, or swimming in a lake or a river, and these are all things that are done. And by the way, not too far from New York City, and also in New York City, a lot of these things are available. Hiking is actually available in Queens. There are forests you can hike in Queens. There actually is a wilderness area in Queens itself. There's a national park called the Jamaica Wildlife Refuge where you could visit and you could see. And actually, that Jamaica Wildlife Refuge was where I went to do the first introductory podcast for this course. And also, if you like to climb mountains, the Appalachian Mountain Club has hikes every weekend. Now we come to our concluding questions for this podcast. Number 1, what is the evolutionary definition of a species? Number 2, which kind of biodiversity does the Shannon-Weaver Diversity Index measure, and what is the formula? Number 3, list 2 benefits to maintaining biodiversity. That concludes this podcast, and I will see you in class tomorrow.